In her most legendary exploit, USS Trout delivered ammunition to the besieged American forces on Corregidor in early 1942. Then, she transported 20 tons of gold bars and silver pesos from the Philippine Commonwealth back to Pearl Harbor, and ultimately the safety of the United States Treasury Department. She went on to serve with distinction in the Pacific War before she was lost with all hands at the end of February 1944. USS Trout was a member of the Tambor-class, the U.S. Navy's first successful fleet submarine. Her keel was laid down on August 28, 1939, at the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Kittery, Maine, and she was launched on May 21, 1940. She was slightly more than 307 feet long, had a beam of 27 feet, and a standard displacement of nearly 1,500 tons. Trout's primary armament was her 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. 6 of these were located at her bow, and the other 4 were located at her stern, and she could store up to 24 torpedoes at a time. The Tambor-class could also substitute mines in place of their torpedoes. She also carried a single 3-inch 50-caliber deck gun and 2 50-caliber machine guns at the time of her commissioning. Trout had a diesel-electric propulsion plant, which powered her when she was surfaced, and also charged her 2 126-cell batteries that she used while she was submerged. Trout had 2 shafts and was rated for 5,400 shaft horsepower and could make over 20 knots when surfaced. She was rated for just over 2,700 shaft horsepower when submerged, which reduced her speed to between 8 and 9 knots. She had a range of 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, and an endurance of 48 hours at 2 knots when submerged. Trout had a test depth of 250 feet and was manned by a crew of 60 men, 6 officers, and 54 enlisted men. After she was commissioned into the fleet on November 15, 1940, Trout took her shakedown cruise and began training along the U.S. East Coast until mid-1941. On July 2nd, she got underway to join the U.S. Pacific Fleet and arrived at Pearl Harbor on August 4th. Trout conducted training operations in Hawaiian waters until November 29th, when she stood out of Pearl Harbor to conduct a simulated war patrol north of Midway. On the morning of December 7th, she received word of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and that night she observed 2 Japanese destroyers shelling Midway from about 10 miles away and proceeded to intercept them, but they retired before she could get within firing range of them. Frustrated in being unable to fire a shot, she continued her now unrestricted war patrol until the 20th, when she returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs and alterations. On January 12th, Trout's second war patrol began when she stood out of Pearl Harbor with 3,500 rounds of 3-inch high-altitude anti-aircraft ammunition to be delivered to the besieged American forces on the island of Corregidor in Manila Bay. After stopping at Midway for fuel, she continued westward and on the 27th encountered a light off her port bow near the Bonin Islands. She closed to 1,500 yards and fired 1 torpedo from her stern tubes, which was her first shot of the war, and missed. She closed to 600 yards and discovered that her target was a submarine chaser. As she had been warned to avoid such ships, she disengaged and resumed her course for the Philippines. On February 3rd, after remaining submerged until nightfall, she rendezvoused with PT-34 off Corregidor at about 7:45 and was escorted through its minefields to its south dock. Manila Bay was under an air and sea blockade by this point and was also being bombed every day by the Japanese. For every surface vessel that succeeded in running the blockade, 2 more were sunk by enemy action, hence the reason Trout was sent, in a clandestine attempt to deliver the much-needed munitions to the beleaguered fortress. Within minutes of tying up, the projectiles were being passed up through the hatches one by one and unloaded on the dock. While the ammunition was being unloaded aft, Trout took on torpedoes through her forward hatch. The 3-inch shells had been stowed in every available space, so all of her torpedoes, except for 1 in each tube, had been removed. She simultaneously received fuel while the offloading was taking place as well. As food supplies on the island were scarce, Trout transferred all the food, cigarettes, and medical supplies her crew could spare. For the remainder of the patrol, spaghetti was the featured dish found on Trout's menu. Around midnight, Trout's commander, Lieutenant Commander Frank Wesley Fenno Jr., realized he would need more weight on board for ballast to help make up for the tons of heavy projectiles that had now been removed. He requested 25 tons of ballast in the form of sandbags or crushed rock, but none could be found. It was at this point that fate interjected itself. As the situation in the Philippines unraveled, authorities in Manila were desperate to find a way to rid themselves of the country's valuables. The wealth consisted of paper currency belonging to both the U.S. and Philippines, and silver pesos and gold bars from Philippine banks and various mining operations. The U.S. High Commissioner to the Philippine Islands, Francis B. Sayre, had been directed by Congress and President Franklin Roosevelt to protect and/or destroy any reserves or assets held by banks, brokers, safe deposit companies, insurance companies, or elsewhere. This included any form of currency, coin, bullion, securities, drafts, checks, or negotiable papers of any type. Sayre, for his part, had in his communications with stateside officials proposed a plan to remove the treasure by submarine, and when Trout presented the opportunity, the mission became hers, as Sayre realized this would probably be his best chance at accomplishing his goal. After obtaining clearance from General Douglas MacArthur by phone, Sayre made arrangements to transfer the gold bullion, securities, and some silver to Trout. She would then deliver it to Pearl Harbor, and the United States Treasury would safeguard the valuable assets for the duration of the war. Commissioner Sayre's financial advisor, Woodbury Willoughby, was placed in charge of the delivery of the treasure and was told to have 20 tons of gold, securities, and silver ready for loading ASAP. There was no time for receipts or an itemized check. It was an all-hands effort to carry the 40-pound gold bars from the Army truck and hand them singly down the hatches of Trout. 319 gold bars were taken aboard, weighing approximately 6.5 tons, about $7.3 million worth of gold. The remaining ballast was received in the form of 630 bags of coins, each containing 1,000 silver pesos. At 3 a.m., Trout got underway again, and 3 miles off Corregidor, she dove in a predetermined spot. There, in 140 feet of water, she waited until nightfall to finish loading her precious cargo. She surfaced at nightfall and met a small patrol craft which delivered the remaining securities and some additional diplomatic mail. Altogether, the gold and silver Trout was about to transport was worth nearly $10 million. As the commanding officer of Trout, Commander Fenno had assumed responsibility for the cargo of gold and silver. The manner in which the loading was conducted was such that neither he, nor any of Trout's officers for that much, could personally check exactly what was brought aboard during those dark hours. Therefore, he put a note on the bottom of the receipt he signed that read, "Received without verification of numbers of bars or contents of the container and the articles described above." The presence of her special cargo did not change Fenno's original orders to carry out his war patrol, and accordingly, he set course for the East China Sea. Bad weather initially slowed Trout's speed and hampered visibility. Pushing through the heavy seas of the monsoon season, she entered the East China Sea on February 10th, and at 4:25 that afternoon, a Japanese cargo ship of approximately 4,000 to 5,000 tons was sighted. 3 torpedoes were fired at ranges of 2,000, 800, and 600 yards, and the second and third torpedoes struck home. 25 minutes later, 4 explosions were heard, which were the ship's boilers blowing up as she sank. For 8 days, she could not obtain a navigational fix or see much of anything for that much. On the 15th, following the orders of her patrol, she left the area and cruised to the Bonins, where she sank a small patrol boat on the 19th. From there, she set her course for home and arrived at Pearl Harbor on March 3rd. Trout moored alongside the light cruiser USS Detroit, and the precious cargo was turned over. At last, everything seemed to be accounted for. However, a few days later, a single 40-pound gold bar turned up in one of Trout's forward compartments. For several days, Commander Fenno had the gold bar in his possession, and no one in the U.S. government was willing to take responsibility for it. Eventually, a Treasury Department official took possession of the bar, and the last remnant of Trout's gold ballast was finally fully in the custody of the United States Treasury Department. USS Trout would go on to conduct 9 more war patrols before being lost in late February of 1944. Japanese records, examined after the war, indicate that one of their convoys was attacked by a U.S. sub on February 29th in the patrol area that Trout was assigned to. The U.S. sub badly damaged a large passenger cargo ship and sank a 7,000-ton transport. A Japanese destroyer then detected the submarine and dropped 19 depth charges. Oil and debris came to the surface, and the destroyer dropped a final depth charge. Trout was expected to return to Midway on April 7th, but was declared overdue and presumed lost when she hadn't arrived or been heard from by April 17th. On April 8, 1945, Trout was officially declared lost and on eternal patrol with all 81 hands. As of the making of this video, Trout's wreck still has not been found. Trout is credited with sinking over 37,000 tons of Japanese shipping and 12 Japanese vessels during World War II. During her first 10 war patrols, she made 32 torpedo attacks and fired 85 torpedoes. She was also involved in 6 surface actions and was attacked with depth charges 8 times. Trout received 11 battle stars for her service in World War II and the Presidential Unit Citation for her 2nd, 3rd, and 5th war patrols. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.